Welcome, and of course, Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you. And we'll let's see if I can move this over a little bit. Yeah. Okay. So we were talking about here Ma'asar Oni, right? The poor person's tithe that happened. It was the second tithe that took the place of the Ma'asar Sheni. So if we think of years divided into sabbatical cycles, into 7-year cycles, years 1 and 2, and years 4 and 5, the second tithe would go to up to Jerusalem to consume it there. And then in years 3 and 6, that second tithe became the poor person's tithe. And we're learning about how they are to be distributed to the stranger, that is the person who wasn't Jewish, and to the orphan and to the widow. And it said, they shall eat it in your gates. This is up here. V'chaluk v'sha'arecha v'saveu, and they shall be satisfied, right? So Rashi here, v'achlu b'sha'arecha v'saveu, tein lahem kedei silvan, give to them as much as they need to satisfy them, to the point of satisfaction. And in Tractate Pe'ah, chapter 10, and in the Sifrei, which is commenting on these verses, Mikan Amru, from this they said, Ein pochtin la'ani begoran, that when you give to a poor person from your threshing floor, you do not give any less, pachot mechatzi kav chitin, less than a half of a kav of chitim, of wheat, etc., etc. So although the Torah does not establish shiur, a fixed amount, one of the things that the rabbis did was to estimate specific amounts as opposed to just guesstimating. So that is something that you find throughout the literature, that the rabbis wanted to give people specific ways in which to observe the Torah, in which to follow the commandments.
What verse are you on?
I am on chapter 26, and we're finishing up verse 12.
Give me a second. Chapter 26. Oh, okay.
All right.
Okay.
Good. So continuing here in the next verse, Va'amarta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, and you shall say, declare in other words, before Hashem your God, Bi'arti HaKodesh, I have removed that which is sanctified, min habayit, from the house, v'gam nitativ lalevi, and indeed I have also given it to the Levite, which of course was the first tithe, v'lager v'layatom v'la'almana, to the stranger, to the orphan, and to the widow, kechol mitzvatcha asher tzivitani, according to all the commandment that you have commanded me. I fulfilled the commandment, in other words, which you have commanded me. Lo avarti mimitzvotecha, I have not transgressed from your commandment, or your commandments. Velo shachachti, and I have not forgotten. I have not forgotten. So that's overlooked, I suppose we could say, right? So let's go on to here, back in here. Here we are. V'amarta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, and you shall declare before the Lord your God. And again, Tractate Sota 32. I just want to say parenthetically that look at the kind of encyclopedic knowledge that Rashi displays here and has been displaying throughout his commentary, in that he has this amazing broad level of understanding of all this vast amount of rabbinic literature, and he can just pluck from it where it fits into specific texts. So I believe that is HaTorah. So I believe, right, the Torah offering, Shenatata ma'asrotecha. Oh no, okay, I'm not comfortable with that interpretation. So hit vadeh. So this is, the vav is pronounced. Had there been two vavs here, I would have known for sure, but it doesn't make sense to say that it refers to the Torah offering. There's been no mention of it. So he's saying hit vadeh. It's an imperative. Make a declaration, right? Confess. Like we talk about the vidui on Rosh Hashanah, or rather on Yom Kippur, or the vidui, that is a confessional. Shinatata, so confess that you have given your tithes. Declare. So bi'arti hakodesh min habayit. I have removed all the dedicated food from the house. So again, from the Sifrei, the commentary on Numbers and Deuteronomy. Ze ma'asar, this is the tithe, sheni. In other words, I have given my ma'asar sheni in years 1 and 2, or years 4 and 5. Veneta revai, and this is, neta revai means the 4th year planting. So we're talking here about trees where in the 4th year of their bearing fruit, you had to take that fruit. The first 3 years, the tree was considered arel, that you did not take any of that fruit. You just let it develop, but you didn't consume it. And then in the 4th year, again, you would take the fruit of that particular tree up to Jerusalem. Velimidcha, and that's neta revai, from revi'i, right, 4th year. Velimidcha, and it teaches you, she'im shaha ma'asrotav, that if he delayed bringing his tithes, shel shtei shanim, of 2 years, velo elam liYerushalayim, and he didn't take them up to Jerusalem, shetzarich lahalotam achshav, that he has to take care of it now. So, continuing with the verse, v'gam netativ lalevi, and I have also given it to the Levite. And we know from a previous comment from yesterday that Rashi is going to say, ze ma'asar rishon, right? The tithe that you give to the Levite is ma'asar rishon, is your first tithe. V'gam lerabot truma uvikurim. And this also includes truma, okay? So truma, these are all the various, I don't know if I could call it taxes, right? But this is what you have to remove from your produce before it becomes yours, okay? So this is to include truma. Truma is that 1/40th or 1/50th. The average, I believe, was 1/50th. If you were generous, you would give a 40th. If you were stingy, you would give a 60th. So somewhere between that, again, these amounts were established by the rabbis, and that went to the priest. That went to the Kohen. And that was actually the first, when you harvested your produce and you took it to the granary, it was at this point, and you smoothed out the crop or the grain. At that point, now that you knew exactly how much you had, that was when you started to remove these particular tithes, etc. And the first thing you do is to remove something called truma, and that was that 1/50th. That was considered sacred, meaning it had a level of holiness that only priests were allowed to consume it. You, if you were an Israelite, would not be permitted, or a Levite for that matter, would not be permitted to consume it. And this you gave to the priest. The one benefit you had from it is that you could choose which priest you would like to give it to. So if you were friendly with a particular priest, you could reward them in this way by giving them truma. The priest had to keep that truma sacred, wasn't allowed to make the priest, it was very important that anyone involved in this did not allow it to become defiled. If it became defiled, if something happened that would render it impure, it had to be essentially burnt. The priest also had to be in a state of purity in which to consume it. So this is the very first removal that you'd have from your crop. And then there were the other things. Then, of course, you would take a tithe, the first tithe that would go to the Levite, but before all of this, you would also have to remove, quite possibly, I would think, before Truma, you might have to take off Bikurim, your first fruits, right? Those were designated as a separate offering, and whatever other specific things like I imagine Neta Ravai might also include those sorts of things. But again, the exact order in which this was done is something that I would have to learn. But I know that Truma was generally the first thing. But it sounds to me that Bikurim would be something that had its own designation. But it could come after you separated Truma. Just makes sense to me that since Bikurim refers to a specific fruit, a very specific, in other words, you had to go, remember, and tie a ribbon around the first ripening fruit. Velager layatom la'amana, as Rashi's parsing this out, to the stranger, to the orphan, and to the widow. Ze ma'asar oni, right? This is the poor person's tithe.
I just want to mention that in the notes that I have, in the Chabad
Yes.
part, it mentions that it's referring, it's, talking about in that first Rashi that you read about how the Truma and the Bikurim go to the Kohanim, and it says, since Kohanim stem from the tribe of Levi, they're referred to here as Levites.
Yes.
And so I think that's why they put that Rashi there too, because it says Leviim and it doesn't say Kohanim.
Correct. So we're talking about sometimes in scripture, in Tanakh, it talks about Kohanim Leviim, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes. So
and it says it's from Yerushalmi Maaser Sheni.
Yes, right. So there's a whole tractate called Maaser Sheni, right? And remember, it was one of the perks that a priest got was to receive the Bechor, was to receive the firstborn or the first fruit, etc., etc. Okay. Kachol mitzvatcha, according to all your commandment, nitatim kisidram. Look at this. So he's talking here about how important the order of giving them is. He says, I gave them according to their order. Seder, remember, means order. Look at this. So Rashi's answering the question that I had asked myself, right? Here he says it. Velo hikdamti truma lebikurim. And I did not take truma before I removed the bikurim. Interesting, right? So now we know for sure that bikurim come first, that removing the first fruits comes before you start removing the truma. Velo ma'aser le truma, and I didn't remove ma'asar, tithing, before I removed the truma. Velo sheni larisho. This is beautiful. How Rashi anticipated the question that I was asking, right? And not the second tithe before I removed the first tithe. Sheha truma kru'a reshit, because truma is referred to as reshit, as the very first. Shehi Rishona Mishin Aseh Dagan. So it is because the truma has to be removed first once it becomes grain, right? Uketiv, and it also states in Shemot Kafbet, Exodus chapter 22, Meleitcha V'dim Acha. So I have to tell you that these are words, Lauren, that I could use help on, right? Lo te'acher. So Malay Acha sounds like it comes from Malay, which means fullness, right? Dim Acha I cannot translate. So if you have the translation, I'm happy to hear it.
Well, I don't see specifically a word like fullness, but it says, you said once it has become matured grain, and then it says, and it is written regarding the separation of tithes.
Yes, go on.
And then it has that Hebrew phrase, which means that one must not change the order set out in scripture for separating tithes.
Right. So did it not translate Malay Acha V'dim Acha?
It just says it means that one must not change the order. No, it did not give a direct translation. Isn't that weird?
Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting?
But
Yeah.
I want to mention also that this clarifies something for me, because when you talked about Bikurim before, the first fruits, you had mentioned as soon as they had like kind of started to turn into a fruit from the flower,
Yes.
but before they had ripened, and my Chabad translation didn't say all that. But now that it's mentioning the truma has to be fully ripened,
Right.
now I'm understanding that gives confirmation that you were right, despite what this translation said, that the first fruits were before the full maturation.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, it's you would just designate them, right? And then you'd wait for it to mature.
Right,
And then
right.
you would give it. Right. So here, lo ta'acher, you shall not delay. Right. So you have to lo, and he explains, by lo ta'acher, you shall not delay. This is the verse. Meleatcha v'dim acha lo ta'acher. That's the Hebrew. That's the quote from Exodus. And he explains, Rashi explains, lo tishaneh et haseder. You should not change the order, right? So it's so funny. Yesterday, Miles was mentioning that he's learning in math the order of operations. And it's like, this is the same thing, right? The result you get has to do with your order of operations. So in mathematics, right? So going on, this is such a beautiful example of how Rashi can take a confusing and puzzling sentence and just totally, bring it to life and bring it to light and help us understand. Lo avarti mitzvotecha, I have not transgressed your commandments. Lo hifrashti mimin al shene mino. Right. So this refers to trying to substitute one species for another species. In other words, trying to think of these tithes as, I guess the term would be fungible. So you can't, if you're taking a tithe of wheat, you cannot, if you had a very successful wheat harvest, and let's say, or however you'd want to argue this out, or a barley harvest, you were harvesting both wheat and barley, and let's suppose the wheat was very successful and wonderful, and the barley wasn't so great. You can't substitute what you need to take from the wheat by substituting barley for it. That's min she'eno mino, right? Al she'eno mino. Umin hachadash al hayashan. Nor if this is now you had to also, again, the way this was processed was according to the year that this particular crop was harvested. So I believe when you're talking about grain, you can, grain will last. You dry it out and it'll store well. And that is the significance, by the way, of these, quote, new years that are mentioned by the rabbis. Everyone is familiar pretty much with Tu B'Shvat as it being Rosh Hashanah La'ilanot, right, as being the new year of the fruit trees, is what it's referring to. So if your fruit ripens prior to Tu B'Shvat, then it becomes 1 year's produce, and that fruit from that tree that ripens after Tu B'Shvat, or say from Tu B'Shvat onwards, would belong to the next year's crop. And so you have to separate tithes from each year's crop. You have to figure it out as to how much you've harvested per year by that. So, and there are different New Years depending, like we know about the year of the fruit trees, but there are also other situations where years count in this particular way. So he goes on, velo min hatalush al hamechubar. So talush means fruit that has been removed, right, or plucked, al hamechubar, over stuff that is still attached. Mechubar is attached, meaning it's either in the ground or on the tree. Velo min hamechubar al hatalush, nor that which is attached over that which is still, has been harvested, which has been detached. So these are various, it's interesting that that's in parentheses. And sometimes, like when you're studying Talmud, if material, because there's so much, written material, and it went through such, it went through before printing, it was all handwritten, etc. And so they sometimes, in some of the editions, by comparing manuscripts and trying to come up with the most accurate rendition of that manuscript, sometimes you'll find words that are in parentheses. And these parentheses generally mean that you don't read it, that it's not included.
Yeah, it's not in the Chabad part, that parenthetical phrase.
Okay, and
And
incidentally, just to complete the comment here, if it's in square brackets, it means it may be omitted in certain manuscripts, but it needs to be added. It does count. It's considered authoritative. So this is all, as you sort of get deeper into study and stuff, and you become aware of these particular issues in terms of trying to extract the truth as much as possible and accuracy. So, last velo shachachti, I have not forgotten. Look at this. Mi levarechacha, right? I did not forget to bless you, al hafrashat masarot, regarding the removal of tithes. So a beautiful, beautiful, explanation and explication of this process to understand it. So again, I think the thought behind all of this, not only, the amount of social welfare involved in all of this, the amount of equity involved in all of this, but I think behind everything, right, is this notion that we don't own this, that this is a blessing, that our possessions are not something that we exert or exercise complete ownership over, but that we have responsibility regarding whatever we're able to achieve, to harvest, etc. And of course, all part of having a relationship with a divine sovereign and treating our Creator as sovereign. So we'll take another, I think we're going to have to stop here. And I'm so glad that we have one more day in which to take a look at this. Let's see, we'll go here and here. And I'm going to mark the place. Let me just take it from where, go back, take the time to do this. Forgive me. In the meantime, if any of you have any comments or thoughts, please feel free to comment if you have any reaction to this. So, any thoughts before we have to quit? Nope.
Well, wait, I have something.
Yes.
I find this also very interesting because I've always taken the best of, and the first and the best of what I have in the garden.
Yes.
and given it to my friends or
Yeah.
my neighbors.
Yes.
And it just seems so natural, and that it coincides with my faith and
It's
where
lovely.
I come from. Yeah.
Right. Mm. All right. There we are. So I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to stop the recording.